Let's talk about that presidential directive dealing with nuclear weapons. In 2013, former President Obama, well, he was president at the time, he issued new guidance for the employment of nuclear weapons that directly correlated with a key component of the just war doctrine in the law of armed conflict. Now, let me quote you the operative phrase from the president's statement. Mr. Obama said, "All U.S. nuclear plans must apply the principles of distinction and proportionality and seek to minimize collateral damage to civil populations and civilian objects." Now, you and your co-author, Jeffrey Lewis, argue that President Obama's doctrine should result in a new doctrine, which you call the nuclear necessity principle. What is that? How would it work?
Let me take you back a little bit to the beginning to help understand how there's been a tradition in the United States, in my judgment, of obfuscating, of using euphemisms about nuclear weapons. Harry Truman, when he announced the dropping of the bomb, said it was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base, so that we could avoid as much as possible non-combatants. He later, when he realized what this meant and the destruction involved, privately said that he didn't want to drop the third bomb that he could have because he didn't want to kill all those women and children. So Harry Truman understood what nuclear weapons can do if they're dropped on a city. Hiroshima did have a military industry along the edge of it, but actually we moved the target from the industrial site to the center of the town so that it would kill more people. So we were deliberately trying to kill lots of people to shock the Japanese government into surrendering. Right?
Did President Truman know about the moving of the target?
No. But he knew that Hiroshima, along with a number of other cities, had been left unscathed by the U.S. conventional bombing attack, precisely because we wanted to blow it up in as dramatic a way as possible once we got the bomb, so that that could compel the Japanese government into surrendering.
Now, isn't there a line of philosophical thought that says that kind of use of a weapon in a war is appropriate if it's going to force the civilians into putting pressure on their government to lay down their arms?
There are people who argue that, and certainly it is a, I think, reasonable argument to make about threatening to do things that you would not necessarily want to do. I think we would not want to kill lots of innocent civilians today under any circumstances, certainly not deliberately. And we have signed agreements that said the principles of distinction, that we do not deliberately target non-combatants. What Obama did by signing that executive order on the employment of nuclear weapons was to tell the military that even with nuclear weapons, I want you to follow the principles of non-combatant immunity. Do not aim deliberately at civilian structures. Now, back on this point that we sometimes use euphemisms, we've had a tradition in the United States that goes back a long ways of saying we don't target populations per se. That was a Nixon administration era statement. But under that doctrine, what we were doing as the guidance was to tell, for the sake of deterrence, this is during the Soviet Union, during the Cold War period, for the sake of deterrence, the military was told that you're supposed to target the ability of the Soviet Union to recover from a nuclear war. Because if they can't recover, that's going to make sure that they don't start it. And so that was the logic of it. But in doing that,
and that meant we were going to target their fertilizer plants and food bins and...
We're doing all those kinds of things. We had this huge number of weapons and a huge number of targets. And we were doing studies to say, well, how quickly could they recover? We claimed that we weren't targeting civilians per se, but our policy, in terms of the way it was being implemented, was to starve them to death. And to me, that's the same thing. That shouldn't be considered to be an ethical way of targeting. So what Obama is saying, here's the president who really cares about just war doctrine, who uses the Nobel Peace Prize speech, not to just talk about peace, but also to talk about just war, that there's evil in the world, he says. There are times where we have to go to war to combat that evil, to respond to that evil, and we will follow the principles of just war doctrine. So now he's putting his money where his mouth is by having the policy really ingrained not just in the laws of armed conflict, which the military is now trained to understand, but also with our nuclear weapons policy. And what Jeffrey and I are trying to do here is to say, is it enough to say, well, we will not deliberately target civilians? And is it enough to say we will use the principles of proportionality? Shouldn't we also say we should not use nuclear weapons against any target in which a nuclear weapon isn't necessary to destroy that target? Because otherwise you could say, well, we want to target that plant or that military base. If it's absolutely necessary for its destruction to use a nuclear weapon, then you have to calculate whether it's proportional. But if you could use a conventional weapon for the same purpose, and it would be roughly equivalent, why would you want to use the nuclear weapon at all? So there have been some who have responded to this saying this is just common sense. Of course we should do it and add that. There are others who say no, because this would weaken deterrence. Because we want the collateral damage that could come from a nuclear attack against a legitimate target, the collateral damage of civilians nearby, we want that for the sake of deterrence.
You want to put the fear of a nuclear weapon in the enemy.
But if you're using collateral damage for deterrence purposes, it's no longer collateral. It's now part of your purpose. So that's where I think the debate is today. And I think it's an important one.